Hi, I'm Jay Faulkner. I'm an open source developer with G Research open source software, and I've been working on Ironic for the last 10 years. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Ironic in the Fake World, which is a new series I'm starting, sort of focusing on how to get Ironic set up in environments that are smaller so that you can check it out, test it, maybe do some development. And for the first one of these, I'm going to focus on Ironic local development setup. But for the full syllabus of what we're covering, we're going to talk about prerequisites, things you're going to need to have installed in order to get this done. We're going to be talking about how you can run unit test manually. We're going to talk about some tricks to have those run automatically on commit, and then talk a little bit about how to run that example Ironic. So first of all, you're going to need Linux of some kind. WSL should be okay if you're on Windows. But I do not know. I would not expect this to work natively on Windows or natively on Macintosh. You're going to need some type of Linux environment. Additionally, you're going to need some packages installed. You're going to need Python and the equivalent dev package. Some distributions call them dev, some call them devil. But you need whatever those development packages are for Python installed for the version you've chosen. You need Build Essential if you're on a Debian-based distribution. If not, you need the equivalent. You're going to need the ability to build Python modules essentially. And along those same lines, you're going to need MySQL Dev or Devil and PostgreSQL Dev or Devil for the same reason, to be able to build those corresponding Python modules. You'll also need Tox and Git. And a little later, we'll talk about you need a program called Pre-Commit as well. But the full list is actually in the Ironic Developer Guide. And as with everything I'm covering in this talk, it's all covered in the documentation. And I'm going to have links down to the relevant documentation down below in the YouTube description for you. So you can just click, read from there. And I'm telling you right now, this is being recorded during the Dalmatian release cycle in 2024. If you go click those links and you find that it's telling you a different way to do things, trust that documentation has been updated, even if this talk hasn't. So great. So first, what are we going to do? We're just going to run some tests using Tox. This is sort of the basic thing that you do. And this pattern works with all OpenStack projects, not just Ironic. You just get yourself a checkout of Ironic, change into that directory, and you can use Tox to exercise several different environments. This is not a comprehensive list. That's in the documentation. But just a few examples, things you can run. You can run linters, which are in the PEP8 environment. You can run tests on any version of Python you have installed, even if ones we don't support yet, which is kind of cool. You can run our docs build. You can run our release notes build. All these are useful things that you can do with Tox. And if you're not familiar with Tox, the tool itself, what it's doing is it's just creating a small virtual environment. In fact, the virtual environment is going to share the name with the Tox environment it's creating. It installs Ironic and whatever dependencies are needed for that specific testing into there, and then it runs a predetermined command on that and gets it all set up for you. So that's what allows us to do complex things and kind of bottle them into one command. If you're ever curious about what's actually happening below the hood, you can just look at the tox.ini file in the root of the repo. It's fairly self-explanatory, but if not, Tox itself is pretty well documented. So let's see this actually in action here. So this example takes about 5 minutes to get from front to back. Basically, we're cloning Ironic, performing the steps we just saw on the previous slide. I'll note that even though in my examples and slides I'm cloning it from opendev.org, there is a GitHub mirror that's official of this. So you can also use github.com/openstack/ironic. And I know that may be easier in some places if you have a workplace with limited access to the internet. So first of all, we're running PEP8, as you can see. Now, the interesting thing here is you can actually see in that install depth step right there that it's not installing Ironic. It's just installing the tools it needs to run lint against the existing Ironic code. And that's sort of some of the fun of Ironic, of Tox, is that you can kind of tell it, here are things you need for Flake 8. And then, of course, now it's going in to do the actual install itself. We're going to skip over a little bit of this. There's no need to watch it wait, but understand it's going to take a while. It's got to install a lot of stuff. It's hiding some output from you. And if you have slow internet or a slow computer, this can take a while. This video, and in fact, the unit test here, the test run you're going to see, was recorded on a Framework 13 with a 12th gen Intel processor. So it's a pretty beefy machine, but it still takes a while. So for lint, you saw it ran. It's already done. This is what you're looking for at the end of any tox run, is that little happy green message of it saying that it's okay. And that means you don't have to look at or pay attention to anything that happened before it. If that's an error, it's going to print out what the error is, what happened. So now we jump into running the Python 3.9 environment for unit test, and this is going to install all the requirements, all the test requirements as you would expect. We'll let that get past there, and it starts running it. So I'm going to note a couple things here. First of all, if you see, it is excluding the test migrations MySQL in this case. And the reason that is that with this testing setup, we don't want to assume you have a database set up. So you can actually look at the tools directory inside of Ironic. There's a file called testsetup.sh. If you look in that, that's what we run in the gate to set up unit tests to be able to run these MySQL migration unit tests as well. So if you'd like to follow those steps, set up an OpenStack CI test user, then you can run the special tox environment we have set aside for those migration tests against a real MySQL, and it'll work for you. But just to keep it simple, we don't require the MySQL unit test in the basic part. And really, while they're a useful thing if you're writing or testing a database migration, for everything else, you're pretty well covered. So you can see this test is starting at about 2:45. This video has about over 5 minutes in it. So the unit tests themselves took about 2.5, 3 minutes to run. You see them flying by now. With Python 3.11 or 3.12, that is a little bit faster, but not significantly so. But we're just going to fast forward here, get it to the end. There's no need for you to sit here and watch this output fly by. Hopefully, we're enabling you to do this. And so if you want to see the full output, hey, run tox locally and see it yourself. That's one of the cool things about having it be so easy and so accessible to do. Let me get back here to this end again. So I'm going to have you notice again, it's going to show the summary at the end, all the tests that passed. We did expect some to skip, so that's fine, but 0 failed. And then if I can catch it, I did. You can see it prints out a quick listing of the longest running tests. And then you get those 2 little green lines at the bottom telling you that everything's okay. So with this, we've successfully run unit test against Ironic by just installing a few packages and running tox. This is great. This is an easy way to get yourself started, but it's not necessarily the only thing you're going to need. So let's talk about if you want some of this to happen automatically. It can be really frustrating if you've written a big change and you go in and you commit it, you push it, and then lint comes back and fails because you accidentally put white space in the wrong place or you misspelled a word or something like that. That can be really frustrating. And so we have a pre-commit configuration file, and pre-commit, like Tox, is a program that's meant to help you automate some of this stuff so you don't have to think about it as much. If you've got the pre-commit git commit hook installed in your repo, which we show an example of how to do this here, you have to merge or apt install it or DNF install it, however your distribution does it. Then inside the Ironic repo, every new checkout you do of Ironic, you'll have to run pre-commit install. And that's because Git hooks are stored on the client side. So if you've got multiple Ironic checkouts for multiple different branches or projects, you're going to need to run pre-commit install in each of them and on every different computer you have. And this is just because that commit hook is a local setup. And this is going to run some of the tests, and we're going to see that happen right now. So you're going to be able to see here that we're starting out in the root of an Ironic repo. We're going to run pre-commit install. And now we're going to look here at the init.py. We're just going to add a misspelling to it. It doesn't really matter what it is. One of the reasons I picked this example of saying I spell good with I spelled EYE instead of the letter I is it lets me point out a limitation of code spell here. If you look, it caught that GUD is not the correct spelling of good, but it didn't say anything about EYE. And that's because one of the limitations of code spell is that it doesn't understand grammar. It doesn't understand context. So it's not going to know that's the wrong version of the word I. In fact, most of the time when you run a spell checker, like in your email client or in a word processor, it's checking the words you've used against a dictionary of known good words. Codespell flips that on its head. Since in software development, we often use a lot of crazy terms or, different things that aren't necessarily dictionary words, it actually uses an allow list of misspelled words. So if you have misspelled a word that's in their list of known misspelled words, it can go ahead and flag that for you. And if there's only one potential correct spelling, you can see right here We were able to use the -W flag to code spell, which we passed through to tox by giving it 2 hyphens there, and get that automatically corrected for us. Well, we know it still says EYE, but we've got the issue fixed and we're able to push it to next. And that's sort of a good example of what pre-commit gets for you here, is that it lets you see that error up front, see it real quick, and then using more of the automation, that code spell tox environment, to fix your problem. So it's a neat little example here. So we're going to move on. Now, that right there was pretty neat, but it doesn't really help you if you're developing something outside of Ironic. It doesn't help you if you're working on clients. It doesn't help you if you are a user who's trying to understand how to use Ironic better. It's only really there for helping out with development, making sure your environment's good and all that. This actually gets you a running Ironic. And so I'll note, the title of this talk is Ironic in the Fake World, or at least, this series of videos. But I want to say this very explicitly. Do not use this method to try to provision actual hardware. This is set up just for development testing. If you want to run actual Ironic, we'll talk about options that'll have that in future videos in this series. I just do want to point out that this is just for testing and messing with clients only. So what you can see here is we've got yet another tox environment. We added one called local Ironic dev, which lets you run it. And so you can see we even install inside of that dev env, that local Ironic dev, we installed a client. So you can actually use the client to create a node and step it through the process. And it works just like you would expect. So let's see it in action here. So what you're going to see here is I've got 2 windows open and ready. This is because I'm going to need one window to run the single process Ironic, which is foregrounded, while in the other window, I'm running the clients. So you might have seen an error scroll by there. It's not a big deal. It's just because I'm operating against a MySQL that's already had the Ironic schema created inside. I might have taken more than one take for these terminal videos, but so you can see on the right side, just by running that tox command, we've got our environment stood up. You can see the output and the logs are continuing to be print there. On the left side, we're setting up that client that we installed inside of that tox environment right beside Ironic itself. So we activate that tox environment. We set the auth plugin to none because we're not doing any authentication. And we're able to go ahead and create a node with the fake hardware driver. One of the neat things about this is that you can actually look over there on the right side and see in the logs, each command you're doing, print out the log as you're running it. And so we create the node. We're going to go ahead and step it through the enrollment process. We're going to put it into management state. Then we're going to put it into available state. And then we're going to do a mock deploy. Now, in the real world, these steps take a long time. But because we're using a fake driver and fake hardware, it's just pushing it through each of the steps, which is a nice, convenient way that you can use in order to test a client, to maybe mock out some early code if you're writing API changes, just to get a feel for how things work. But there are some limitations to it. So let's talk a little bit about what those limitations can be once this demo completes. You see, we've got it. The provision state prints, and we're back at available. So that's kind of our happy finish. So there are some caveats, like I said. It's just a hello world for Ironic's API and conductor. The fake driver and interfaces do not execute any meaningful driver code. And that driver code in Ironic is like where a lot of our secret sauce is. It's where magic makes Ironic magic is there. And because it's single process, you can't even test like the remote call interactions between an API and a conductor. You're really just testing our API code, our basic layers, and against the SQLite DB, which is very useful. It's used in some of our other projects, but we don't support upgrades on MySQL. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. We only support upgrades on MySQL. We don't support upgrades on SQLite at all. So this isn't really giving you a good look of what things look like. It's a useful tool, and getting an Ironic running in one command is great, but we can do a little bit better. So let's look at a local Ironic. So I'm going to use the word MySQL throughout this. I've probably already done it a few times, but I am going to let you know that, you can use MariaDB with this. It's fine. I'm going to say MySQL because I'm an old school guy. I've been doing this since before MariaDB existed. So I always think of them as implementations of MySQL, even though I know it's not the case. But so we're going to set up whatever SQL server you want that's MySQL-like and get it going. You'll install it via whatever distro specific method, app, DNF, emerge, whatever you're using there. You're going to start that MySQL, and then you're just going to need to create that database using, whatever you like. In this case, I'm just using the MySQL command line. And then we use tox. And I'm going to point out that we pass it the no test option here. That's a special option you can pass to tox if you want it to create a tox environment, but don't run the stuff inside it. So we're just using this as a shortcut to get ourselves an environment that Ironic runs in. There's a step missing from on here, and this is part of why it's useful to read the docs about this. You will need to pip install PyMySQL as well, which is the MySQL driver. We don't put it in the requirements because obviously you can use Ironic with SQLite. We even have some historical support for Postgres, so we don't want to require someone to install the MySQL driver if they're not using MySQL, so that's sort of a manual step. So you'll create that environment, you'll activate it, and then you'll run Ironic DB sync. Yeah, you can see it here. This is a better example. And so we've got it. We create the etc. We copy the existing config out to etc ironic conf local. We adjust it to add a MySQL DB connection string and change the RPC transport to JSON RPC. You're going to see this scripted out in a video here next, but understand that, all this is in the documentation. I'm running commands that are documented here. So let's look at it happening here. Well, before we get to the video, when we run it, we're going to need two separate windows. We're going to run the Ironic API and Ironic Conductor instead of just the single word Ironic process. And it's going to work. So let's look at the video. You see over there on the left side, I documented the steps to do real quick. Just start MySQL, create the database, create the configuration file, create the database schema, run Ironic Conductor and API, and then use it. So just to show I'm starting out with a fresh database here, I drop database Ironic, create database Ironic. And we're going to run tox to create the local Ironic dev with no test. It's going to do a little bit of an install here for us. Didn't take very long because I've already cached that environment. Next, we're going to take the configuration changes that we need to do. You can see we're copying out the existing Ironic conf local dev. We modify it to add a database section and a MySQL connection string, and we modify it to change RPC transport to none, which is for single process Ironic, to JSON RPC, which is one of the options we have for spread out. We also support RabbitMQ. That's out of the scope of this video. Then you see I replace the kind of placeholder password with a password that theoretically works. In this case, it's single word password just for purposes of this video. Then don't make the mistake I made. You have to activate the tox environment before you can run Ironic DB sync, because that is a command that gets installed in that environment. So you activate it, you run it pointing to the configuration, and it's just going to create the schema on the database and stamp it with the version, at which point we're ready to start the conductor in the API. Now, for the rest of this demo, it's not going to look appreciably different because Ironic's Ironic, right? Like it works the way you would expect. The API behaves the same. It's still configured in no auth mode. You're going to have two separate log files printing out here to standard out instead of just one. But really, it's basically the same thing. We've got Ironic API we're talking to. That API will talk to the conductor to do work. In this case, it's all fake work, but it's still doing that communication. We still set that OS endpoint to our localhost Ironic that's running with the auth type of none. And then we're going to create a node, and I'm just going to show you here that node does get created in a real MySQL database and not just in SQLite. Yeah. And you'll note we have to create it with the driver fake hardware. And that's what tells Ironic that it doesn't need any of the actual information you need for a real node. Because if we were creating real nodes here, we would need to specify, like addresses to talk to the out-of-band controller and all of that. But we're able to get away with not providing a lot of information because we're using that fake driver. That's part of the advantage of this. It takes some of those details out of your mind. But you can see here, there's your proof. It's in the database. We created a node. That node's in the database, and it's all created and active. So that's pretty cool. Now, so another fun trick, You can add some configuration to your ironic.conf.local dev or ironic.conf.local to add some extra behavior. We support delays in the fake driver, and this is useful for if you want to test out certain failure scenarios, such as, just making power actually take time, because in the real world it takes time. You can implement a random delay by specifying the two numbers there. So, for instance, the deploy delay of 60 to 360, that's going to be randomized across the curve there. So you won't know exactly how long stuff takes, and it helps mimic the real world for you a little bit more. Well, that does it for the first episode here of Ironic in the Fake World. Local Dev, we're going to be talking in future episodes about how to run Bifrost locally, which gives you a little bit more fully featured dev for standalone Ironic. And then after that, we'll be talking about DevStack, which is the overall OpenStack testing scenario, which does some pretty cool tricks to help us pretend that it's bare metal. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about Ironic, you can click right here over on my side. I'm going to have a link up to 10 years of Ironic features, which is talking about sort of, after the 10 years of Ironic, what's all the stuff we do. And over there in the other link, if you click it, you can go ahead and subscribe, and you can be ready to see whatever's next. There's a podcast on this channel, the Gross Out podcast, where we talk about the real stories of open source. There's lots of really good conference talks here about ML, things like Armada, things like Fast Track ML. Lots of content here on this YouTube page for you. You can also subscribe to our podcast at podcast.gr-oss.io. See more about us at our Twitter or on opensource.gresearch.com. But for now, I'm Jay Faulkner, open source developer with G Research Open Source Software, signing off. Thank you.